Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 213, Duping a Grand Duke, or the Awakening of Friedrich III, which is also episode 11 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. How long can an emperor not be an emperor? The official record stands at 25 years. That's how long Friedrich III had stayed out of the core areas of the Holy Roman Empire. That meant 25 years of Imperial Diets without the presence of an emperor, 25 years of stasis on the challenges of the time, the reform of the empire, and the defense against the Ottoman expansion. But sometime in the late 1460s, the apathic emperor Friedrich III, dubbed the Imperial Arch Sleepy, awakes and does what he had never done before: something. And that something turned into a lot of things. Some related to imperial reform, but the most significant something for European history was a marriage. Well, an engagement for now, followed by a flight down the river Mosel away from the intended father of the bride. Yes, it is that famous marriage, just not in the way you may have thought it happened. But before we start, I wanted to ask you what you want for Christmas. There's so many of you who contribute to the show either financially or by telling their friends and family about the history of the Germans. And I had originally thought I would provide a regular flow of bonus episodes for you, but this was ultimately not feasible. As we moved out of the early and high Middle Ages into the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, the sheer volume of information and the quite frankly bewildering complexity of the period has made demands on my time that left no room for bonus episodes, even though you surely deserve them. So, I'm going to produce a Christmas special, and if you are a patron or a one-time donor to the show, you can choose what this Christmas special is going to be. Now, here are the options based on proposals I have received over time. First, a classic Q&A episodes where I will try to answer all your questions. Second, a travel itinerary through Germany where I give you 5 to 10 places I think you should see and there are not on the classic route. Or third, a maximum 5-minute recording of me butchering German Christmas songs. I will send you an email in the next few days from my email address historyofthegermans@gmail.com with a poll. Just click on what you prefer and I will deliver, but please don't make me sing. And if you want to participate in the poll but you've not yet signed up as a patron, you can do so at historyofthegermans.com/support as Ulrich M., Natalie W., Christopher T., Noel F. and Stepan C. have already done. And with that, back to the show. We are in the 1460s, and it is make or break time for the Emperor Friedrich III. The head of the House of Habsburg was a case of terrible miscasting. For all we know, he would have been much happier as a simple imperial prince living in his castle in Wiener Neustadt and tending to his garden and his beloved wife Eleanor. If that had been his fate, he might have ended up as Friedrich the Fruitful, last mentioned in an 1878 biography by a renowned medievalist at the University of Graz, appreciated for his tasteful late Gothic funeral monuments, his contributions to the growing of cucumbers, but otherwise completely forgotten. But that was not his destiny. Instead, the electors, believing for some reason that he was the foretold last emperor who would finally bring peace and justice to the land, if not ring in 1,000 years of bliss, and had elevated him to king of the Romans. And they were sorely disappointed. Friedrich was apathic, always looking for compromise and happy to step back his ambitions. He had kept away from the issues of the empire, not even shown himself there for 25 long years, and this long period of inertia had gained him the nickname, the Imperial Arch Sleepy. But he was also an intelligent and a genuinely serious person. We do not know whether he realized his shortcomings, but he believed profoundly in the sanctity of the office he had taken on. Even though he had neither the resources nor the charisma to enforce the imperial rights, he never abandoned them. He was, if anything, a staggeringly stubborn man, the kind of doggedly tenacious person who would let his family be bombed to smithereens in the Hofburg rather than giving up his rights to the Duchy of Austria. Before he had been elected, he had devised his personal motto, the letter A-I-E-O-U. Like his ancestor, Rudolf the Founder, who had devised his own secret script, Friedrich was into astrology, puzzles, and mysticism. So he never declared officially what this acrostic was supposed to mean, leaving everybody guessing. When he first mentioned it in his notebook in 1437, it might have meant Amor electis in justis ordinor utor, which means something like friend of the chosen and avenger of the unjust. But then he could also mean alle Ehre is ob uns, all honor is for us, or Aquila electa justa omnia vincit, the chosen and just eagle conquers all. Friedrich not only saw the empire as eternal and superior to all the other princes, he also firmly believed that the House of Austria was exceptional. He had fully bought into the Privilegium Maius, the great forgery of his ancestor, including the fake letters by Caesar and Nero that granted Austria preeminent status in the Roman Empire. He took as gospel the Austrian chronicle of the 95 rulers that had emerged around the same time as the Privilegium Maius. We talked about that in episode 204. That was a history of the land of Austria that went back to the year 1500 BC. Here we are reliably informed that this glorious land had once been founded by Hercules' son Norix and had been ruled first by Jewish patriarchs, then directly by the Roman emperors and the Babenberger dukes, before its great mission was taken up by the Habsburgs. Friedrich had the coats of arms of these 95 imaginary predecessors immortalized in stone in the courtyard of his castle at Wiener Neustadt. He confirmed the validity of the fake Privilegium Maius in his function as emperor, and he had the Babenberger Duke Leopold raised to sainthood. And somehow in his head and then in his propaganda, these two strains merged into a narrative whereby Austria was the natural inheritor of the imperial title and predestined to unite Europe. And that is what the most common interpretation of A-E-I-O-U is. Austria est imperare orbi universo, or in German, alles Erdreich ist Österreich untertan. And both of these mean all the world is subject to Austria. It is from here onwards that the members of the House of Habsburg, even when they were ruling far-flung lands in Spain or Naples or Flanders, referred to themselves as members of the Casa di Austria, the House of Austria, the dynasty that was predestined to rule over the whole world. But in 1470, this idea of an all-powerful Austria was preposterous. As we heard last week, Friedrich's neighbor to the south, Matthias Hunyadi, the king of Hungary, was reorganizing his kingdom along the lines of a modern Renaissance state, complete with humanists, libraries, and a standing army. A standing army strong enough to hold back the mighty Ottoman Empire, and hence infinitely more powerful than any levy Friedrich could muster in Austria. And the man who had so often come to Friedrich's rescue, Georg of Podiebrad, the king of Bohemia, had himself come under a lot of pressure. His past as a leader of the Utraquists had finally caught up with him. Pope Paul II had revoked the Compacta that had readmitted the Utraquists into the Catholic Church and in 1466 excommunicated and deposed the king. Matthias Hunyadi found it in his heart that he, as the shield of Christendom, had to pick up the burden of stealing Georg of Podiebrad's crown. But as it turned out, Matthias wasn't as good a general as he was an organizer and book collector. So despite his extraordinarily well-trained and well-equipped army, his progress against Georg was slow. But as far as Friedrich was concerned, Podiebrad could no longer be relied upon to come and take the conquerors out of the fire, as we Germans would say. And the big question was what Matthias would do once he was finished with Bohemia. Next up, the alliance of imperial princes who had already tried to replace Friedrich twice had become even more powerful. They had won the Mainzer Stiftsfehde and the Princes' War. Friedrich's allies, the Markgrafs of Baden, the Duke of Württemberg, and Albrecht Achilles of Brandenburg, were licking their wounds. and then the Wittelsbachers had added another Prince-Elector to their list. In 1463, the canons of Cologne had elected the brother of Friedrich the Victorious as their new archbishop and Prince-Elector. And they might have lost Georg of Podjebrad as their champion for the title of King of the Romans, following the latter's excommunication, but they were now talking to the richer and more powerful Matthias Hunyadi, who was contemplating a bid for the imperial throne. Not a man with modest ambition, was he? But that was still not all. The empire had not only to deal with the resurgent Hungary looking north, but also with the Duchy of Burgundy, that was disentangling itself from France and was looking to expand eastwards. The Duchy of Burgundy as an independent state had come about initially because King John the Good of France, who wasn't very good as a king, had given the French Burgundy to his beloved youngest son, Philip. Now, Burgundy is one of those confusing places and political entities. The name goes back to a Germanic kingdom created in the 5th century. That was then absorbed into the Merovingian kingdom and broke up into several parts in the 10th century. So there is the already mentioned Duchy of Burgundy, which is roughly equivalent to the French region of Burgundy around Dijon and Beaune. Then there is something called the Free County of Burgundy, which is near Besançon and in French is called the Franche-Comté. Then there was a Kingdom of Upper Burgundy, which is roughly today's French-speaking Switzerland with its centers in Geneva and Lausanne. And finally we have Lower Burgundy, which covers the Rhône River from Lyon to Arles and also contains some of the French Alps. Now the Burgundy we're talking about today has its nucleus in the Duchy of Burgundy, so not the kingdoms or the Franche-Comté, but the Duchy of Burgundy. After Philip, called Philip the Bold, had received the Duchy of Burgundy from his father, he married the heiress of the immensely rich county of Flanders, who also brought Brabant and Limburg in the family. There was one duke in the middle called John the Fearless, but it was under the third duke, Philip the Good, who ruled from 1419 to 1467, that the Burgundian expanded aggressively into the empire. We did already discuss the acquisition of Hainaut, Holland and Zeeland in episodes 198 and 199, but Philip the Good wasn't done with that. Throughout the remainder of his reign he added Luxembourg, Namur and Liège, making him truly the Grand Duke in the West. The Burgundian rulers were immensely wealthy because they owned the great Flemish trading and cloth-making towns of Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels, Ypres and for a long time, the Burgundians had been focused on French politics, where they were the deciding force in the 100 Years' War. It was the Burgundian support for the English that forced the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, whereby the son of Henry V would become the new King of France. But when Henry V died and England was careering towards the War of the Roses, the Burgundians got into a bit of a pickle. Now, they were originally French princes. The French did not like them very much anymore, something to do with burning of a virgin in Rouen, I heard. So, as much for self-preservation as for self-aggrandization, the Grand Dukes of the West needed a new title and a new position. And that title and that position had to come in or in conjunction with the empire. And then came the son of Philip the Good, Charles, who we call the Bold, but which the French call le téméraire, the reckless. Charles built a huge standing army, and he ordered tapestries that depicted him as Gundobad, the 5th century king of the Burgundians. And he would often talk about the Emperor Lothair, whose lands once covered a broad stretch of territory all the way from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. All things that made many people inside the empire nervous, including the Emperor Friedrich III, who, as we have just heard, already had a long list of things to be nervous about. He was actually so nervous he did something he had not done before, which was to do something. As I said, he wasn't stupid or a total pushover, just slow, deliberate, and keen on the quiet life. But a quiet life was no longer on the cards. If he wanted to get out of this situation, and most importantly for him, preserve the honor of the House of Austria as well as that of the imperial crown, he needed to find new allies and new approaches. The first thing he did was to go to Rome and reconfirm his close relationship with the papacy, now that his friend and former Chancellor Pope Pius II was dead. What he got from this meeting with Pope Paul II, apart from promises of support and friendship, was the approval of separate bishoprics for Vienna, Wiener Neustadt, Ljubljana, and I think one more. Important steps that allowed him to deepen and consolidate his power at home. But that kind of stuff was no longer enough. The powers arrayed against him had grown far beyond that once important power base of his family. So in 1470, Friedrich III completely reversed his policy stance. It is as if he had listened to a poem by János Pannonius, the great Hungarian humanist, who wrote, "Rome was once saved by Fabius delaying, but your delays, Friedrich, have brought it to breaking. You're always consulting and never quite doing. Couldn't you act for once and stop all that chewing? Or hearken to Saturn, the most frozen of stars? Far better if emperors were guided by Mars." Credit goes to Martin Rady for that brilliant translation. After 25 years of not setting foot into the empire or calling diets and assemblies, and eternal dithering and debating and delaying, Friedrich III took off his Imperial Arch Sleepy head. The solution to his problems lay in the empire. If he could only harness the power of the imperial princes in the defense of his homelands, well then he may be able to face off against Matthias Hunyadi and all these other ones. And how can he get that done? Well, one thing that would definitely help would be delivering on imperial reform. In 1467, he issued another common peace, this time including an outright ban on feuding. Anyone pursuing a feud without authorization was guilty not just of a breach of an imperial order, but he was guilty of lèse-majesté. Lèse-majesté had only one sanction: death. Now, that was significant in two ways. First, the concept of lèse-majesté is part of Roman law, the famous laws of Justinian, which granted the emperor, in essence, absolute power over legislation, jurisdiction, and execution. These powers have been circulating and have been claimed by the emperor since Barbarossa. We discussed them extensively in episode 55, but that was 3.5 years ago in podcast time and 300 years in actual history time. So in the meantime, Roman law had permeated so much of European, specifically continental European jurisprudence. What appealed was that Roman law was structured and comprehensive. Justinian had made sure that his great opus had an inherent logic, where each element connected with the other in the creation of one coherent legal philosophy, the exact opposite of the Germanic law, which is built on tradition and precedent. It was Roman law that was taught at the universities across Europe, making sure that lawyers from different legal traditions and speaking different languages could still understand what each other meant, negotiate agreements, and argue cases before each other's courts. And it was immensely popular with the kings and princes as it cut through the messy set of ancient rights and privileges, the estates and other representative bodies that pointed to tradition and long practice to hem in the ruler. So whether it was the Renaissance states in Italy, the grand kingdoms of France and Hungary, or the German territorial princes, everyone was busy implementing Roman law principles. And Friedrich III jumped on the bandwagon when he added the lèse-majesté to the arsenal in his fight against feuds. And he did actually implement these rules, at least to the extent he was able to. When his mercenary captain Andreas Baumkirchner declared a feud against the emperor over unpaid bills, which was entirely legal at the time, Friedrich lured him to Wiener Neustadt and had him and 2 of his colleagues executed for lèse-majesté, where the only sanction was death. He had finally learned to walk and chew gum at the same time. In 1470 he had a visit from Adolf of Nassau, the Archbishop of Mainz. Now, we've met him already in episodes 191 and 186. Not a nice guy. But Friedrich is no longer Mr. Nice Guy either. He needed to get stuff done. And Adolf was the kind of guy who could get stuff done. Adolf took charge of the Imperial Chancery and the Kammergericht, the redesigned professional court system that Friedrich had established in 1442, but that had fallen into disuse. And Friedrich showed himself again in the empire. In 1471 he called the princes of Christendom to Regensburg for a grand assembly to discuss what to do about the Ottomans. Admittedly, that was a bit late, a touch self-serving, as Ottoman raiders had been penetrating into Styria, and it yielded the usual zero result. But at least Friedrich was breaking the ice. He was no longer Saturn, the most frozen of stars. And Mars was on its way. But before we get there, we need to take a detour to see Mars's lover, Venus. Not for himself, obviously. Since his wife Eleanor had died in 1467, he had not shown any interest in other women or men or anything, either out of his natural inertia or in an attempt to create another holy imperial couple, like Henry II and Kunigunde. No, the worship of Venus was reserved for his one and only son, Maximilian. The last time Maximilian had appeared on the scene was in 1463, when he was a 4-year-old hiding in the cellars of the Hofburg, but now, i.e. in the year 1473, he had grown up to be a strapping lad of 14, ready to take on his duties as son and potential successor of the Holy Roman Emperor. And his father had an idea, or more precisely, his former Chancellor Aeneas Piccolomini had that idea a long time ago. An idea so cunning it would change the history of Europe, quite fundamentally. And that idea was for Friedrich to take a leaf out of the book of his ancestor, Rudolf I, and properly leverage his imperial title. Not by calling in vacant fiefs that he would do later, but by offering crowns in exchange for marriage. And the person he was offering the crown to was Charles Le Téméraire, the Reckless, the Grand Duke of the West, the Duke of Burgundy, Luxembourg, Limburg, Gelder, Count of Flanders and Namur, advocate of the Prince-Bishoprics of Liège and Utrecht, etc., pp. And in exchange, Charles would offer the hand of Mary, his only daughter and only child, in marriage to Maximilian of Austria. What an amazing deal. Charles gets what he always wanted, a crown and independence from France, and the House of Habsburg brings home the richest heiress in Europe. But before you go, hooray, we're finally getting into how the Habsburgs had married their way to the top, let's first hear what actually happened. Now, such a seminal transaction could not be done over the phone or by messenger. The two principal actors, no, not Maximilian and Mary, Friedrich and Charles, needed to meet. And that meeting took place in the autumn of 1473 in the city of Trier. Friedrich had come with an entourage of imperial princes, his son Maximilian obviously, but also several prince-electors, in total about 2,000 men. Charles Le Téméraire arrived with his own standing army of 15,000 and a full display of the wealth and power of the Grand Dukes of the West. Charles had reached the pinnacle of his career. He had clapped his adversary, King Louis XI of France, in irons. He had brutally suppressed an uprising in his own city of Liège, had allowed his troops to plunder and burn the place down, so that the Austrian ambassador wrote back to his master that Liège was covered in a blanket of red snow, only the stumps of the church towers sticking out. After that, the proud cities of Flanders, even the mighty and unruly Ghent, submitted to the will of the Duke. And that was followed up with the annexation of the Duchy of Gelder and the agreement with the Duke of Lorraine that turned that duchy into a protectorate of the Burgundians. And with these acquisitions, Charles had finally connected the family's original possession, the Duchy of Burgundy, with their main power base, the Low Countries, in one contiguous territory. And he was extending his tentacles further south by acquiring the Habsburg lands in Alsace from Friedrich's dissolute cousin Sigismund of Tyrol. Very slowly, that kingdom of Burgundy, maybe that empire of Lothair, was rising again. When Charles rode into Trier at the head of the army that had burned Liège, that had taken Geldern and had intimidated the Duke of Lorraine, he insisted on showing the other side of Burgundian power, the splendor of his court. He arrived wearing a cloak bedecked with 1,400 pearls and 23 rubies over his gilded armor. He wore a hat, well, not yet the most famous golden hat, but still an ostentatious garment featuring a stork feather decorated all over with precious stones. Charles had brought what looked to many like his entire store of household goods, cloth of gold and ermine for himself and his entourage, the finest tapestries from the unsurpassed workshops in Arras, Tournai, and Brussels, plates and cups made from gold and silver, the most dazzling armor from Milan, manuscripts lavishly decorated by the Limburg brothers, and travel altars by Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, and whatever bling there was, Charles had it, and lots of it, and he was flaunting it. The contrast to the austere and in comparison completely penniless emperor was stark. And what made the whole thing even more awkward was that Friedrich as the king and emperor ranked far above a mere duke, even one who had more land, more soldiers, and a lot more money than he had. So the first few days were taken up with questions of etiquette about, who was walking before who was sitting next to who, etc., etc. Only once that had been settled, negotiations could begin for real. Charles' opening bid was that he would like to be elected King of the Romans, and thereby become Friedrich's successor as emperor, but he would then also sponsor the election of Friedrich's son Maximilian, who would then become his heir by marrying the delightful Mary of Burgundy. Friedrich very much liked that very last bit of the offer, but the other elements, not so much. Friedrich was not at all willing to allow a King of the Romans to be elected during his lifetime. A new King of the Romans might take leadership of the Imperial Reform movement and then sideline him. And that reluctance even extended to his own son, let alone would he have given it to the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Now, fortunately for Friedrich, he could hide behind the reluctance of the prince-electors to endorse Charles' candidature. Friedrich still had a majority in the College of Electors, having strong links to the archbishops of Mainz and Trier, the Duke of Saxony and the Markgraf of Brandenburg. But these links were not strong enough to convince them that they should elect someone with a standing army of 20,000, reckless ambition, and a reputation for utmost brutality. Plus, I really not enjoyed being upstaged by the Burgundian glitz and glamour every single day for a month and a half. So Friedrich proposed an alternative option. What he could arrange for was the elevation of the Duke of Burgundy to King of Burgundy. That was an ancient title the empire had acquired under Conrad II, see episode 24. But it had been a long time since an emperor had been crowned King of Burgundy. I think the last one was Karl IV. But, the title had never formally disappeared. Now, I could not find out what exactly the constitutional construct for Charles' intended royal title had been. Was it a title like that of the King of Bohemia that gave a degree of independence but retained the bond of vassalage to the empire? Or was it meant to be an elevation to be an independent royal title, as it had been bestowed on Poland and Hungary in the 11th century? Now, even if it was a bit vague, Charles was keen. The royal title, he was sure, would help him to turn his various territories with their respective institutions and traditions into a coherent political entity. And he just really liked to wear a crown instead of just a ducal hat. So he had his many goldsmiths produce such a crown, and a scepter, an orb, and all the other accoutrements, all in the finest and the latest Burgundian fashion. He summoned the Bishop of Metz to preside over the coronation ceremony. But before that went ahead, the last business end needed to be tied up. the engagement of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. Now, as it happened, only Maximilian was present at Trier. Mary had stayed behind in Flanders, depriving the emperor from inspecting the merchandise, which irritated him no end. Charles seemed to have brought his entire household, just not its most important member. But even though she was sight unseen, still the engagement went ahead. Now, with all the agreements signed and completed and announced, Charles spent his days devising ever more elaborate parades, rituals, and costumes to display his soon-to-be elevated status. Whilst Friedrich had very different thoughts. Well, we do not know what these thoughts were, and historians have debated them back and forth for a long time, but what we do know is that in the middle of the night, on the day before the intended coronation, Friedrich, with his small entourage, boarded a ship and slipped out of Trier. When Charles heard about it, he sent his trusted lieutenant and governor of Upper Alsace, Peter von Hagenbach, to intercept the emperor. Hagenbach and his men rowed as fast as they could along the Mosel River, and when their horses broke down, they swapped them for a rowing boat, and they rowed as hard as they could. Finally, they caught up with the emperor. Now here's the historian Bart van Loo's description what happened next. Quote, Hagenbach, who was fluent in French and German, could address Friedrich III in his own language and asked whether His Majesty wouldn't wait a bit for the Burgundian Duke. Hagenbach said that Charles felt wretched about the emperor had risen so early. If it pleased Friedrich to exercise patience, the Duke would be able to say farewell in a more dignified manner. So even in these delicate circumstances, courtesy remained an important consideration. Now, Friedrich agreed on condition that it would not take too long. When half an hour had passed and the vessels were still bobbing in the stream, a frown appeared on the emperor's face. Hagenbach declared he would fetch his master. He could not be far away. Friedrich nodded. The governor of Upper Alsace then jumped into his boat, but he was barely out of sight before the sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire gave the order to continue the journey. By the time Hagenbach reached the Duke, the bird had flown. End quote. What followed was an epic tantrum. Charles le Téméraire had always been famous for his outbursts, but what his courtiers observed on this day, November 25, 1473, went beyond what anyone had ever seen before. Charles locked himself into his room and smashed all his furniture like a 15th century Keith Moon. This day that he had hoped would be one of glory and triumph had become one of fury and shame. The Duke of Burgundy had been played in the most outrageous fashion. His daughter, the greatest prize in the European marriage market, had been given away for nothing. Breaking the engagement wasn't an option because it would make his embarrassment even more obvious than it already was, and there was also no other means to acquire a royal title. The rage that he felt about this would send him on an ever more reckless path to achieve his dream of reviving the early medieval Burgundian kingdom, or even the Empire of Lothair. And this path will lead him to a small town between Cologne and Düsseldorf, the city of Neuss, and into one of the longest and the most celebrated sieges of the Middle Ages, though celebrated more vigorously in the German lands than in the dominions of the Burgundian dukes. But this story and how that elevated both the sense of unity amongst the subjects of the empire and the emperor himself is what we will look at next week. I hope you will join us again, and if you feel the weight of a golden hat compressing your neck, or you get tired of your thousands of pearls sewn into your ermine coat, you could augment your splendor by donating your fellow listeners a few more weeks of advertising-free listening to the history of the Germans. You know where to go, you know what to do.